Hi, this is Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop in Seattle, Washington, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about this B25 and some work that's getting done on it. No specific topic for this video, but just kind of going into some stuff. This is an instrument that has been in here a number of times. This is a longtime customer, and this is a particular instrument of his that I've seen a number of times over the years at this shop for various work here and there, setups, and I installed the pins, saddle in this thing, and I did some other modifications to this guitar that I just wanted to kind of briefly talk about. So this is a Gibson B25, and if you're familiar with these guitars, these were kind of a budget line for Gibson back in the day, and originally the bridges on these guitars were a kind of hollow plastic thing that was bolted on with almost a 1/4 pound of steel. Like if you take the bolts out and just like kind of hold them in your hand, it's a lot of weight. And weight on the top of an acoustic guitar is not so great. What that means is that the energy from the strings is having to spend a lot of itself kind of moving that weight around that's doing really nothing for the tone, instead of moving the top itself, which is the thing that's going to be producing the volume and tone of the instrument. And on top of that, that hollow plastic bridge really doesn't provide a good connection from the saddle to the soundboard. And so when this came in years ago, I took a look at that bridge, and at this point, most of those B25 bridges are kind of shriveled and shrunken and, you know, kind of chipping and kind of turning to that powdery stuff that old plastic kind of tends to turn into. And I recommended, hey, is this going to be a player or is it going to be a showpiece? Because if it's going to be a player, why don't you let me pull that bridge off and we'll replace it with a solid wood bridge that's actually glued down. And you'll get better volume out of it, and you'll get better tone out of it. It'll sound much nicer, just as an instrument. And so we ended up doing that back in the day. This was several years ago that we did this. And, I just remember when he picked it up that he was just blown away by it, because it is a stark difference putting one of these bridges on there compared with having one of those original bridges on. And fortunately, for any of you out there with thinking about maybe doing the same thing, there are companies out there that actually produce retrofit bridges for these B25s. There are two types of Gibson bridge. There's the one with the saddle forward, and then there's the one with the saddle back. And if you have a B25 that you're thinking of doing this to, you just want to get the one that has the saddle back. And that is to say, you want the one that has more space from the saddle to the front of the bridge. And when you start comparing, the images that you're seeing, you're going to go ahead and see that it's a pretty stark difference. So you're not really gonna have a hard time distinguishing between the two. So that was definitely one of the things that we did. We also added a compensated bone saddle to this to help out with intonation, which tends to be another problem that these B25s have. And also added some bone bridge pins, which look nice, last longer, and also I feel like kind of add a little bit of sparkle to the tone. It's not a super noticeable difference, so I'm not going to be on here kind of telling you to put your ears down to your instrument and, listen for those tiny, tiny little subtleties, or hook it up to an oscilloscope or whatever to see the difference between bone pins and plastic, whatever. But I do notice that there's a little bit more high-end slightly, and there's a little bit more sustain when I install these. But the more important part is that these last a lot longer, and they tend to chew up the holes a lot less. So that's a good thing to do. I wish that these didn't have such a thick pick guard on them, because this pick guard is also one of those things that adds a lot of weight kind of needlessly. So, if you're kind of trying to race car driver your B25 and trying to strip down all the unnecessary weight, this may be another thing that you want to take a look at too, because it's not really that difficult to remove one of these pick guards. And on top of that, with the age of these instruments, these celluloid pick guards are honestly getting to the point where a lot of them are shrinking and kind of peeling up anyway. And so what you might want to do is pull that off and replace it with kind of a thinner, lighter pick guard that's going to rob a little bit less of the tone from the instrument. But in this case, we opted to keep the original. So moving on down, this guitar has had a nut installed. Not sure where this was done. It's not one of mine. And it's also had some, crack repairs. Those are also not my cleats, but I'm glad that this crack in the back here was cleated. Sorry for the lack of focus there. The thing that this is in here for today is that this guitar has been developing some buzzes. Now, this year in Seattle has been particularly bad for humidity issues. And I think that that's because this has been kind of an unseasonably cold. And honestly, you know, saying this for Seattle is a lot, but it's been an unseasonably wet winter. There's been a lot of rain, much heavier rain than we usually get. A lot of people kind of associate Seattle with rain, but usually what we get is kind of this light drizzle, and mostly it's just like cloud cover and fog. This year we've been getting a lot of rain. And what I think is happening is that a lot of people are turning on their heaters, and heaters tend to dry out environments inside. And so what's happening is that, you know, there's been a lot of this kind of back and forth probably between, you know, humidity being kind of high on the days that those heaters might be turned off, and humidity being kind of low when those heaters are turned up. And that's the kind of thing that tends to affect acoustic instruments quite a lot. That top will kind of swell as humidity gets absorbed into it, and it'll kind of collapse a little bit when humidity is not present. And so what that does is, if you can imagine that bridge sitting on top of that membrane, the strings kind of come up and the strings kind of come down as that top swells or lets go of moisture. And what happens as a result of that is that the string height rises with that setup. And sometimes you need to compensate for that. One way to compensate for it is that you'll hear in a lot of cases of somebody having like a summer and a winter saddle for their guitar. This is largely to compensate for differences in humidity and temperature during those times of year. Typically, what you'll do is you'll wait until the guitar kind of starts acting up, and then you'll pop the strings off. You'll pop the saddle out, and you'll replace the saddle, and it'll play more or less better than it did. It's a good idea, honestly, though, if you're a pro player, to go ahead and get 2 setups done a year. One time for the summer, one time for the winter. That's if you're touring. I don't necessarily recommend that for like every single player, unless your livelihood is dependent on that instrument. I can't in good conscience recommend that people spend that much money on setup work. But we're doing a little bit of setup work on this to kind of compensate for, the issues that this has developed this winter. We're also going to be touching up these little dings in the back of the neck here. And this is a really, really common thing to see on older instruments like this. These dings come about as a result of, a guitar getting swung into like a cymbal, or, just dinged on a corner of a counter or something like that. And even like jewelry, if somebody has like, rings or something on their hand when they go to grab the guitar, that can kind of dent and ding this thing. In general, these are a very commonly handled part of the instrument, and as such, they kind of tend to result. It kind of tends to result in a lot of little nicks and dings here. And so we're going to try to repair these. Now, what I'll say is that this isn't like a super necessary thing to do because, the neck is perfectly playable with these on there. But for some players, it really bothers them to feel a difference and feel that little tiny ting there, I can definitely see why that might be an issue, but we're going to be filling these in. Normally, when a guitar comes in here for like a setup, that's a pretty quick turnaround, but I had to tell this customer in this case that this was going to be a while because I gave him the option. So we can either do these fills with super glue, so cyanoacrylate, CA glue, whatever you want to call it, and get them done pretty immediately. Like that could be done in an afternoon, or we can do it the right way, and we can start filling these in with lacquer, which is the finish that this instrument is finished in. The difference between the two is that cyanoacrylate builds up fairly quickly, and it cures fast, and it cures very hard. And so when you apply those thin layers of cyanoacrylate, most of what you're putting on there stays on there. And when it cures fast, it cures hard, and so you're able to just kind of go in there and wet sand and buff it out pretty quickly. But when you're doing lacquer fills, lacquer is a solvent evaporative finish. So about 70% of what you're applying ends up evaporating while you are waiting for it to dry. And so those layers end up being very, very thin when you're doing these types of repairs. The other thing about it is that you need to be very careful to build those layers up very, very slowly, because what can result from trying to build those up too quickly or too thick is a thing called solvent popping, which causes the finish to not quite cure out all the way. And it also causes these little bubbles and stuff to appear. It gets kind of gross. And so you definitely want to take it very, very slow. But the end result is that you end up with a finish repair that's the same hardness, more or less, than the finish. And so when you go to sand that and buff it out, you end up with a much smoother, much cooler looking thing, because the super glue fills are definitely visible. And in this case, we opted to do the lacquer fills, which are going to take a little bit longer. So be an interesting and cool, fun thing to do. I guess, yeah, it's pretty cool. Kind of a legacy with this instrument here. You know, as you work on instruments over the years, you know, you start seeing kind of the same customers more and more, and you start seeing the same instruments more and more. And I don't know, it feels kind of nice to see this familiar little guy in here again. You know, just especially knowing that, you know, this big major modification was done here at my shop, and you know, definitely helped this instrument play a lot better for the customer. So, you know, very, very happy to see this guy in, and be very happy to lovingly take that time to work on those dings in the neck, and, you know, do a little bit of setup adjustment on it, and, you know, get this thing back up to snuff for that player. Really, really looking forward to it. Anyway, like I said, no particular topic for this video. I just kind of wanted to talk about this instrument and kind of some things related to these B25 guitars and finish repair and some other stuff that was just kind of on my mind looking at this thing. Usually I try to select a topic for a video, you know, repair technique or something along those lines. But, you know, I'm just feeling a little sentimental today, so here we go. Anyway, this has been Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop in Seattle, Washington. If you found this video cool, you can drop me a little bit of money in the Ko-Fi link or the Patreon link down in the description. If you liked this video, you can also check out the rest of the videos on my channel, because you might also appreciate those as well. Also in the link are a URL to my Reverb page, where I do sell some instruments that I fix up here at the shop. All of the instruments that I fix up have been heavily gone through. Usually fretwork has been done, nuts and saddles have been installed, and some really cool upgrades have been done. They're not necessarily the cheapest used instruments, but they are, if, you know, I toot my own horn a little bit, very nice used instruments. And there's also a link there to my website, which has my contact information, pricing info, and everything else, in case you're in Seattle and want to get some work done. Anyway, this has been Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop in Seattle, Washington. Thanks for watching.